Today marks the 6th day that Russian authorities have held an American citizen accusing him of spying. But two former CIA officers are telling NBC News that it is, quote, inconceivable that he was serving as a spy. Here's Secretary of State Mike Pompeo this morning in Brazil.
We've made clear to the Russians our expectation that we will learn more about the charges, come to understand what it is he's been accused of, and if the detention is not appropriate, we will demand his immediate return.
The U.S. has been granted consular access to the detainee, and today we're learning more about Paul Whelan. He was born in Canada, but is a U.S. citizen raised in Michigan. According to his brother, Whelan worked in law enforcement for a period of time and served in the Marine Corps Reserve for 14 years. His highest rank was Staff Sergeant, and he served in Iraq for just over a year across 2 deployments. But in 2008, he was reduced in rank and given a bad conduct discharge on unspecified charges related to larceny. Whelan worked for staffing agency Kelly Services until early 2016, currently works as Director of Global Security for automotive components company Borg Warner. Whelan first went to Russia in 2006 on a Defense Department R&R program, according to his twin brother David. Paul was in Moscow this time, helping coordinate a wedding for a friend from his Marine days. David said his brother went missing on Friday, December 28th, after touring the Kremlin Armory with others. But the Russian government didn't formally notify the U.S. of the detention until Monday. The Russians say Whelan was on a, quote, spying mission. Now, we do know that Paul Whelan maintained a VK page, or a Russian version of Facebook. Here's what his twin brother had to say about that social media presence.
He'd met people while he'd been traveling around, and he connected with them on social media. And he would tell us that when he was traveling, he would go and visit those people. So I expect that he probably had a VKontakte page because his Russian friends had a VKontakte page.
Paul Whelan could face up to 20 years in prison under Russian law. Here's what his brother said about the claims of spying.
There's no way that Paul is a spy. Paul had a law enforcement career before his Marine career and is in corporate security. And I think of all the people that I know, he would be the most aware of the risks of getting sideways of law in a foreign country.
I want to bring in Ambassador Wendy Sherman once again, who served as Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs in the Obama administration and is author of Not for the Faint of Heart, Lessons in Courage, Power, and Persistence. NBC News intelligence and national security reporter Ken Dilanian has been following this as well. Wendy, I want to start with the breaking news, or at least that we just learned, that the U.S. has been granted consular access to the detainee. What does that involve, and what can we learn from it?
Well, actually, I'm very glad to hear that, because international agreements required Russia to give access within 72 hours. And given that Paul Whelan was actually taken 5 days ago, they didn't exactly meet that requirement. Those consular officers are going to check on him, make sure that he's well, that he's being treated fairly, try to get details, though I'm sure any interviews will be listened to by the Russians. They will provide English-speaking legal assistance, suggested attorneys that Mr. Whelan can use, and make sure that they can visit him and make sure that he's doing okay. This is likely to be a long process, unless, of course, this is really a tit-for-tat by President Putin to get Maria Butina back in a spy swap, even if Paul Whelan is no spy.
What do you think the chances are that that's what's going on? Of course, we heard Vladimir Putin say that there was not going to be any retaliation for Maria Butina, but what are the chances that that's exactly what's happening here?
I think it's pretty high chances that that's exactly what's happening here, and the Russians probably were aware of Mr. Whelan because of his previous trips, because of his contacts, because of the wedding. Who knows? Probably because of the social media postings that he did. It was very interesting this morning when Secretary Pompeo said he didn't quite have the facts yet, but if indeed it was inappropriate, then we would demand his immediate release. I believe we should have demanded his immediate release under any circumstances and gone from there. It's a little bit curious what Secretary Pompeo did, but then again, our entire approach to Russia is more than curious.
Yeah, and Ken, you spoke with two former CIA officers who said they didn't think that Whelan was spying for the U.S. What did they tell you?
Chris, they say that his activities just don't fit the blueprint for American espionage in Russia. Russia is one of the hardest spying targets in the world. It's what the CIA calls a denied area. Americans who go there tend to be under surveillance, and CIA officers, when they spy in Russia, they do surveillance detection routes. They take steps to evade surveillance. Everything they do is carefully planned out, and when they meet a Russian, it can take weeks of planning, and they would never send a civilian under non-official cover on some random mission, somebody who's not trained in espionage, in to gather information. It's just not how the CIA or other agencies operate in Russia, Chris.
Yeah, and I want to go back, because it did strike me as really curious when I heard Mike Pompeo this morning, Ambassador, saying if the detention was not appropriate, that the U.S. would, demand his immediate return. So let's call that the public statement. Behind the scenes, privately, what should the administration, what should the State Department be doing?
We should be demanding his immediate release. Anyone who travels to Russia as an American citizen ought to be protected. That is our responsibility as a government. That's actually what diplomats spend a great deal of their time doing, which is making sure that American citizens are safe and sound, and also to make sure that American business can operate. If I was an American business and was sending my employees into Russia and saw that people could just be picked up and thrown in jail as a spy, I'd be very wary about doing business. So this isn't good for Russia, but I think it speaks to a larger problem. We have no Russia strategy. We've seen that in how the president's approaching Syria. We've seen that in terms of Russian interference into our election. There's $120 million at the State Department that was appropriated for the State Department to deal with Russia's propaganda. Not a single cent of that money has been spent. We have no Russia strategy, and I'm a little concerned that Secretary Pompeo's sort of approach this morning was less than robust.
Hey, MSNBC fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there and click on any of the videos here to watch the latest interviews and highlights. You can get more MSNBC for free every day with our newsletters. Just visit msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up now.